This week we're looking at the growth of nationalism, not just as an ideology, but as a form of popular culture in the various constituent parts of the United Kingdom, and this includes England as well as Scotland and Wales. I'll try and give a few nods towards Northern Ireland as well. This is a naughty question because there's an assumption built into it that nationalism has indeed increased in all parts of the United Kingdom, which may well be true, as we'll explore, but that doesn't mean that our assumption is unproblematic. For instance, English nationalism has undoubtedly increased in recent years, but we might argue that English nationalism has in the past been expressed as a form of British nationalism. Furthermore, we can show that Scottish nationalism has been articulated in different ways from the early 20th century to the kinds of representation we see with Nicola Sturgeon in office today. When looking at the rise of nationalism, we have to start, I would argue, by thinking about the political vacuum that it is responding to, or indeed that may be being created into which it is filling. So we could argue that historically there was this sense of Britishness. In 1910, the Times in an editorial argued, what is a nationality if the people, stress people, of these islands do not constitute one? Well, in a sense, of course, they're imposing an arbitrary unity on the people rather than peoples of these islands at a time when this is nearly 20 years after Parliament had voted for Scottish Home Rule for the first time in 1893, in the midst of calls for Irish Home Rule. Clearly, the people of these islands did not necessarily constitute a singular nationality. Instead, what you had was a dynastic state, a state which had come together as the result of a union of crowns in the 17th century, and subsequently had been consolidated by the merger of institutions such as parliaments and flags and other symbols of identity as well. But the sign that this is still at bottom a dynastic state, with elements which are left over from the Duchy of Normandy, such as the Channel Islands, for instance, is in the proper title of that state, the United Kingdom of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, by grace of God, and of her other realms, etc., overseas. At bottom, that's what this particular state is. Britishness is a veneer, it is a form of integration concocted in order to tie these various elements which came together as a result of that dynastic union into one unified polity. Back in the 18th century, one of the ways in which that happens is through the forging of war and economic linkages, both internally and externally through the empire. Arguably, in the course of the 20th century, some of these things which helped bring the United Kingdom together also start to drive it apart. So among the things we need to look at is how is this political union tied together through devices such as the distribution of welfare? Is that done evenly across the whole of the territory? Taxation, is that done evenly across the whole of the territory? The imposition of Economic change, is that done evenly across the whole of the territory? The concept of internal colonialism, as applied to Britain in the 1970s by Michael Hector, argues that the answer is no, that what you have is uneven development as a result of the way in which elites are used to maintain control of particular parts of these territories, and that you have uneven political and economic development resulting from these kinds of things. Once you move into a system where you have a mass media culture and a mass consumption culture, these differences become more palpable and start to undermine a sense of commonality across a nation. These considerations are then exacerbated by changes in the post-war years. One of the issues that all of this raises is, well, if Britain is a country now, then it's a country which has a past, problematic past, and the question of how do you write in that past when it comes in bits and reflects imperial passages and imperial movements of people, and how do you tell a story of a unified future to which all of those people encompassed by the term Britain can actually look forward to and identify with. One of the problems I'm trying to point to this slide, in this slide, is whether we're talking about 4 nations within the United Kingdom: England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, or whether we're talking about 5, with the 5th nation being Britain, and that part of the movement in the course of the 20th century is from Britain being the first nation, the nation that people immediately think of, to being one which has become somewhat residual. And this is arguably a problem when you're looking at racial change within Britain. How far those various national identities within this territory are civic identities or ethnic ones. Scottish National Party now would argue Scottishness is a civic identity, and you can certainly see people from ethnic minorities who serve as ministers in the current Scottish executive. The question is whether that has been successfully articulated in all parts of the United Kingdom as well, or whether what we're seeing in some of these nationalist outbreaks in recent years as a kind of reaction to social, economic, and indeed racial change. Well, one way in which you try a political order together is economically. So you can use a currency, and indeed the United Kingdom has one currency. It may have different pictures on it once you go to Scotland or Northern Ireland, but it has one currency. You can have a fiscal unity to mean that everyone falls under the same taxation, which is arguably problematic because not all areas are going to be economically equal. Indeed, this is recognised as the state becomes higher spending in the late 19th century. So a mechanism for divvying up the budget across the elements of the United Kingdom is first articulated by the Chancellor Goshen in 1887. In the mid 1970s, this man pictured here, Joel Barnett, updates the formula. This remains broadly the basis of what we're looking at now. And as you can see, you could look at this and see the United Kingdom being held together by net transfers from England to the rest of the territories. In practice, if we were to break England down, you would see that what we get is net transfers from everywhere, from southeast England and London to everywhere else. So this, of course, is actually very common within states, and it's used to try and deal with the tensions which might otherwise occur within those political systems. Fiscal transfers like that help to reduce unemployment and economic deprivation in other areas, but it can of course mean that public spending levels are much higher as a proportion of GDP in, for instance, Northern Ireland than they are in southeast England. In other words, in the early 20th century, he was contesting the construction itself of Scottish national identity, and part of the way in which he did that was by attacking an image of the kilted Highlander who serves on the imperial frontier, and instead focuses his attention to the renewal of Scottishness and Scotland as an economic unit in and of itself, without being tied to this supposed equal partnership with England in the imperial project. National identity, as George Mikes points out in his How to Be an Alien, published in 1946, is established through the representation of difference. So here you have this Hungarian immigrant to England writing in quite an amusing way about how different he finds the English, and playing upon stereotypes of how the English represent themselves culturally in a variety of ways. Of course, these differences do not necessarily create a sense of nationalism as a political project. So what Mikes is talking about are quotidian representations of national identity, often unspoken, often unacknowledged, often unconscious. When does nationalism then spread? Well, to some extent, nationalism can be a unifying project from the centre. So one of the most famous books on the creation of a sense of national unity is Eugene Weber's 1970s book, Peasants into Frenchmen, which he talks about the creation of a national curriculum in France, acting to both establish a common French history, but also a common French language across all the dialect differences, ranging from Occitan to the Normandy. In the same way, the 19th century project of developing education in Britain helps to create a single sense of a national history, though of course once you have a sense of your history being left out of it, or your language being left out of it, it can actually produce an opposite reaction. Similarly, people can react to a sense that their land and their vital economic interests are being threatened, that their labour markets are being threatened by in-migration. People can respond to international conflicts which can either unite people, or if they seem, so we could argue the two world wars and the Cold War play a considerable part in uniting the British and the removal of those external threats. And instead, the sense that Britain is being subsumed within an external actor called the European Union leads to increased fissiparous pressures, with the English, used to being top dogs, very much reacting against that kind of development far more than the Scots. And for different reasons, those in Northern Ireland, who are obviously conscious of the way in which being in the EU erodes the border. So the international setting can be one of the factors in the spread of nationalism. Politics, the role of political elites, either in containing fissiparous pressures or deliberately playing them up. Sport as either a channel for containing national pressures, so you can express your irritation with the English by occasionally beating them at football or rugby, but it can also be a channel for increasing national sentiment. Migration and differential patterns of migration can certainly lead to reactions, including racist reactions. Differential social mobility is a major factor in resentment, and if that emerges along national lines, or appears to emerge along national lines, then it can be weaponized as a form of nationalism. Even if it has no basis in reality, it only has to be perceived to be weaponized as such. And finally, economic decline and the idea that we need to factors which are seemingly being done to us is the final one of these factors, but arguably often the most important in creating grounds for nationalism. What I will say by concluding on this slide is that all of these factors operate to some degree, and to some extent the emergence of nationalist ideologies reflects combinations of them, particularly the way in which particular groups of elites utilize messages around some of these factors. Cultural distinctiveness is becoming increasingly apparent in Wales in the course of the later 19th century around issues like landowning and agriculture, and the tensions that emerge, not least animated by religious differences. And similarly in Scotland, you can see a rise in a need for a distinctive sense of Scottishness after the Great Disruption of 1843 undermines the ability of the Kirk, the Church of Scotland, to speak for Scotland. A response to this from the official British state is exemplified by elements of administrative devolution for both countries. So Scotland gets a Secretary of State from the 1885. Wales sees the first distinctive Welsh legislation in the Sunday Closing Act of 1881 and gets its first administrative devolution in the Welsh Board of Education in 1907. So what this is reflecting a rise of cultural nationalism, which doesn't entirely contain it. You can see cultural nationalism gathering strength in and around the First World War, culminating in the founding of Plaid Cymru in 1925 and the various mergers which lead to the emergence of the Scottish National Party in 1934. These tendencies to have a national expression of Scottishness or Welshness are, however, contained. Arguably, unionism is itself a form of nationalism, and a powerful and a successful one. And that unionism is partly around its ability to portray Scottishness in particular as being part of a wider British enterprise. In this instance, as a partner in empire. And you can see this in this slide with the representation of Jamaica Street in Glasgow and the way in which Glasgow in the interwar years portrays itself as the second city of empire. The economic benefits of being integrated into this empire through fiscal, currency and trade means are also played upon. And there is, if you like, a cultural dimension and shared sense of Protestantism, a shared sense that Britain as a country has been providentially blessed. That empire in itself bolsters a sense of who the British are. So there may be a distinct sense of Scottishness, but that can sit alongside and indeed can operate within a larger sense of Britishness. In other words, Scottishness and Welshness and Britishness are not antagonistic. They may be for some. People like Saunders Lewis, who in 1936 responds to what seems to be the differential treatment of beauty spots in Wales by the national government, choosing to put a bombing school there, responds to it by firebombing that school. This sense that that Wales is being mistreated and undermined in this way, however, is only starting to come together, only starting to be felt by a large number of people. 500,000 Welsh people who signed petitions against the location of the bombing school at Pennyberth, for instance, are emblematic of the way in which cultural and indeed distinct geographical differential treatment of Wales and Scotland can undermine a sense of their sharing in a British enterprise. Otherwise, people like Nye Bevan, Welsh, South Wales mining stock, Minister of Labour in the post-war Attlee government, can see socialism as something which operates across the whole of the country, the welfare state operating across the whole of the country, and thereby present unionism, a distinctive, if you like, leftist form of unionism, and centralisation in order to distribute evenly social goods, or evenly as far as possible social goods across the whole of the population, becomes another of the attractions of union. It's only by the time you get to the aftermath of union, that you can have dystopian novels such as the Scottish author Irvine Welsh's Marabou Stalk Nightmares, in which he plays upon tropes of empire and the way in which that no longer works to hold the British national construct together. It's often presented that Welsh nationalism is much more cultural and Scottish nationalism is much more economic, and you can see an element of that in this particular slide. But I think these distinctions can themselves be somewhat artificial. Language has an economic dimension to it. After all, if you need to use a different language in order to access labour markets, then that has implications economically. So to some extent, the agitation against using Wales as a source of water for England, the creation of the Capel Celyn reservoir for the benefit of Liverpool, for instance, is a resistance to Wales being seen as a kind of repository for primary products, in this case water, for its larger neighbour. And I think for people like Gwynfor Evans, who by the 1960s is the leader of Plaid Cymru and is its first MP when he wins the Carmarthen by-election in 1966, this distinction can easily be exaggerated. In the same way, in Scotland, although the tone of Scottish nationalism seems to be more located around how do you deal with economic decline, language is less important as a factor except for distinctive nationalists such as Hugh MacDiarmid. It's nonetheless the case that nationalism still has a cultural dimension. So in Scotland, you could say there's a cultural dimension of protecting the dignity of heavy steel operations, hence the need to locate the Ravenscraig steel plant in Scotland, and the symbolic importance of it when it closes during the major years. And of course, to some extent, the British state appreciates these cultural symbols, which is why when the Macmillan government is faced with the demand for one new steel plant, they actually create two, one at Ravenscraig and one at Port Talbot, one in Scotland, one in Wales. In the long run, that political decision doesn't turn out to be a very good economic decision, but it was arguably an attempt to contain these nationalist pressures by economic measures rather than by looking at rebooting and reconfiguring the British Constitution so as to manage these fizziparous tendencies. The nearest the British get to that is by further steps in administrative devolution in the course of the 1960s. So the creation of a Secretary of State for Wales in 1964, followed 5 years later by the invented tradition of the investiture of the current Prince of Wales at Carnarvon Castle in 1969. These economic and social pressures lead to the emergence of permanent blocks of Plaid Cymru and SNP MPs from the 1970s onwards. It does not necessarily have a mean that this is really a breakthrough. They've become nationalism has become a political force. It is not the political force in their respective countries. Indeed, the British state is still looking at instrumental ways of staving off the rising nationalist tide caused by these economic and cultural factors I've been talking about. So Ted Heath, as leader of the Conservative Party, comes out with his Declaration of Perth in 1968. The Labour Party, which in the 1960s is overwhelmingly unionist. I remember Donald Dewar once saying to me that the only Scottish Labour MPs who were in favour of devolution in the 1960s were himself and John Mackintosh. Responds to these kind of pressures by moving towards offering devolution in the Labour government in 1974 to 79. Partly as a reaction to that, and partly because of her own predilectations, Mrs. Thatcher drops Heath's pledge for Scottish devolution in 1976. But the government that she then forms in 1979 is, in due course, to give another fillip to the nationalist cause. Firstly, because of the way in which economic management of Wales and Scotland seems to be so centralised, partly because of the tone-deaf approach Thatcher appears to take in her approach to both countries, not least in the way in which she was felt to have talked down to the people of Scotland in her so-called Sermon on the Mount at the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in 1988. And partly because the changes in the economic structures of Wales and Scotland see a shift away from economic management in terms of more or less autonomous manufacturing companies who can see an advantage in being tied into the larger British market because they can sell their products into it, to a shift towards more globalised, more footloose financial and service sectors, for whom being tied to the union is not necessarily an advantage. All of this and the way in which Thatcher manages the union means that by the end of the 1980s, nationalist causes have become stronger. Thatcher's third successive election victory in 1987 essentially achieved in England gives a further tweak to this process. Labour returns 50 MPs in Scotland and they get dubbed the Feeble 50 by the SNP. This both gives the SNP a position whereby they can turn their fire on Labour as well as the Tories. Up until this point, the Labour Party had been able to contain the SNP to some extent by depicting them as tartan Tories, not least because a lot of the vote that the SNP picked up initially was the former Protestant working class who had been the backbone of the voters for Scottish unionism. Instead, the 1987 election reinforced the idea that Scotland had a distinctive voting system, that Scotland was a social democratic country, something which people wouldn't have said in 1955 when the Tories won over 50% of the vote in Scotland. And the combination of these two elements was firstly to reinforce a notion of Scottish distinctiveness, and secondly to give the SNP a stick with which to beat the Labour Party. The Labour Party, by following Donald Dewar's lead in picking up again the question of devolution, a question which was taken forward particularly in the Independent Constitutional Commission set up at the end of the 1980s. This was, if you like, a Labour version of the kinds of things we can see in this slide labels as containment, that you make changes to the Constitution, or indeed look at making changes to the Constitution in the case of the Kilbrandon Commission, as a way of containing these developments towards nationalism. So when Stormont breaks down in Northern Ireland in 1972, you replace it with power sharing. You create a new institution within that territory to try and deal with the identity politics of that territory. You try and deal with the identity politics of Wales by buying off Gwynfor Evans, or responding at least to Gwynfor Evans's hunger strike, by creating a Welsh language television channel called S4C. Michael Forsyth, as Secretary of State for Scotland under John Major, engages in the gesture of sending the Stone of Scone back to Scotland in 1996. A group of Scottish nationalists had actually stolen the stone from Westminster Abbey in 1950. But now it was officially returned. Arguably, again, it's a little too late. Whether devolution was a little too late, of course, remains to be seen. In the version of devolution that Blair went for in the 1990s, they use a different kind of model to the 1970s, and they don't have built into it some of the measures that had happened in the 1970s. Instead, Blair goes for a process of saying there are a few reserved powers, principally things like security and social security, which are held by the British state. Every other form of administration in Wales and every other form of legislation, with the exception of things like fiscal policy, are fiscal policy. There's a minor element of fiscal policy devolved to Scotland. Everything else is something that now lies within the powers of what is no longer administrative devolution, but legislative devolution. That these new bodies can actually make rules and laws, eventually in Wales as well, for their given tendencies. Whether this strategy of containment works is, of course, another matter. If devolution to Scotland had been conceded in, for instance, the 1950s, you had a two-party system then of Conservatives and Labour, with the SNP very much on the sideline, and the Constitution would not then have been in play. Devolution in the 1990s, by which time the SNP are a major party, and they are the party who are pushing for change in a system in which the constitution is constantly a political issue, creates an opportunity for them to grow, particularly because they can always play the card of pressing for more change against the resistance of Westminster and Whitehall. So to some extent, the new constitutional arrangements are fundamentally unstable. These are also compounded by economic grievances continuing to be around economic decline and North Sea oil. Economic decline is reinforced by the differential impact of globalization, and the globalization writ small, in terms of the harmonization legislation emanating from the European Union and the resistance to what seems to be homogeneity that this creates. In the case of the English, or a large part of the English, this seems to lead to a resistance. So whereas Scotland in 1975 was the only part of the United Kingdom who voted against the terms of joining, Scotland in the 2016 referendum is the most definitively in favour of being in the European Union, possibly in part because the English are not. And for the English, the referendum debate in 2016 expresses a whole series of concerns that are wrapped up by Michael Skay in his 2011 book National Belonging and Everyday Life, in his concept of ontological security, feeling secure, feeling comfortable, feeling that you have a control over your circumstances. And indeed, you could see this as being a moment of English nationalism emerging increasingly from the 1990s with the rise of UKIP. Ironically founded by a Scot called Alan Sked, but it becomes very much an English nationalist party and expresses a sense of a need to feel safe, comfortable, at home, and a vulnerable cultural anxiety. So to conclude, my key takeaway is that to answer this question, I would start off not by talking about the rise of nationalism, but paradoxically the decline of unionism and Britishness, by looking at the factors and institutions which used to support that unionism as a national project, as a form of nationalism, and that Britishness as a form of identity, and the way in which the decline of empire, changes in the world economy, and cultural pressures have undermined both those identities and the parties, the political parties, which acted as the carriers of them. Instead, economic and cultural factors in tandem have tended to fuel Fissipar's tendencies. The British state, in its attempts to contain these and to reinvent the Union, has concentrated on limited concessions rather than redesigns. People first talked about creating a federal Britain back in the days of the Union of the Crowns in the 17th century. But what we've seen is a series of small, incremental responsing and very much responses rather than redesigns in the course of the post-war years in particular. The result is that nationalism has increased, is increasing, and shows no sign of diminishing.